Few things are as responsible for the making of the modern world as precision engineering, and yet it remains invisible. We live customizable lives, expecting the universe to conform to our expectations, and yet beneath this manifold exterior exists a world of exactness so precise that it passes largely unnoticed. It is this world of increasing perfection, uniformity, and repetition that we speak about today, in a conversation on the genius brought to bear by humanity in reshaping the world, as well as an homage to the craftsmanship and personal touch that gives our world its meaning. Our endless striving for that which is flawless is most human. Yet, try as we might, we cannot rid the world of all its imperfections. Humanity, after all, is by its very nature hopelessly, beautifully, fatally flawed. To err is human, said Alexander Pope. Perfection is divine. This week on Hidden Forces, Simon Winchester, precision, and the making of the modern world. So there are bound to be listeners to this show who have read your books. I'm sure of it, obviously. And, I've, like I said, confession, I've only read The Perfectionists, but you've written The Professor and the Madman. Just here, let me look here on Amazon. This has got 900 reviews, and you have basically 5 stars, which is, I've seen a lot of books, and I know that's right up there. But you have such a variety of work. The Men Who, what is it? The Men Who
United the States.
The Men Who United the States. The Map That Changed the World. That looks amazing. I feel like I would love that. I heard an interview you did talking about your book on the Pacific. I just thought amazing. You basically, what it seems to me is looking at your work, let's say if I were looking for books, it seems that you take something that doesn't necessarily seem like a topic and you turn it into one. And that's what I felt about The Perfectionist. When I first saw it, I said, wow, that's a book I want to read, like A History of Precision Engineering. But I never would have imagined to do something like that. How did the idea for this book come together?
It came from a reader. The only book thus far where a complete stranger sent me an email out of the blue, a chap called Colin Povey, who lived in Florida, a place called Clearwater. And he said, I've read all your books, which is nice, and I've liked them, which is even nicer. And I've often wondered whether someone, and I think it should be you, should write a history of precision, which is integral to all of our lives, and yet it's sort of invisible. It's like the air we breathe or the language we speak. So we don't think about it, rather, like you said. And I put it to my editor, HarperCollins, my publishers, and they said, yes, it sounds a good idea, but we can't quite see the sort of narrative thrust, the through line, as they call it. In other words, you could write it as a series of sort of episodic essays, but that wouldn't be very satisfactory. So does precision have a beginning? Does it have a middle? Does it have a conclusion? And in doing some research, I was able to find out, and I think without cheating as well, that it does have a specific...
When you say cheating, what do you mean?
Well, I mean, you could fudge these things. You in theory, you could always invent a through line. But I came up with a through line which was real. And what I did was I looked at the very first thing which one can say legitimately was precise. And that was a cylinder made in 1776 on May the 4th, which people remind me now, of course, is Star Wars Day. May the 4th be with you. Not my joke, theirs. And that was made for James Watt by an extraordinary, eccentric Englishman called John Wilkinson. And he made it with an exactness, a tolerance, if you like, between the outer wall of the piston that Watt wanted to put in it and the inner wall of the cylinder that he had invented, of the thickness of an English shilling, which in those days, 1776, was 1/10 of an inch. And with that number, 0.1, I thought there's the beginning of a through line, because that would be chapter 1, and chapter 2 would be 001, and chapter 3, 00001. So each chapter would be more precise, if you like. It would be more exacting tolerances, up to the very present day when they're what I believe are the limits of precision engineering. Things are being machined to 1 to the minus 28 zeros and then a 1. So very, very tiny little tolerances. So that gave me the narrative thrust of the book, and the editor seemed to think it was a reasonable idea. And mercifully, the reviewers have too, so everyone wins.
So to clarify for our audience, when you're talking about tolerances, what do you mean?
Well, if you like, the easiest way is how well it fits. Our shoe has got a tolerance of, I don't know about your feet, but let's say an
tolerance
eighth
of
of an
error.
inch. Tolerance of the amount of allowable error between the size of your foot and the size of your shoe. Obviously, with a shoe, it's a great deal. But with a tiny piece of, let's say, a motor car, the tolerances are tiny. I mean, they would be thousandths of an inch. With a jet engine, they would be thousandths of a millimeter. So tolerance is a crucial and critical aspect of precision engineering. And I should perhaps at this point tell your listeners the difference between precision and accuracy, which people often get confused with. So it's boring, but let's get the boring
No,
bit
it's
out of the
actually
way.
not. I didn't know this either, and I found it very educational.
Well, in the English language, there are no synonyms, and precision and accuracy are not synonyms. Accuracy, the best way of sort of realizing it is to think of a dartboard. Your intention when you throw arrows or fire bullets at a target is to hit the center. And if you do that, if you have achieved your intention, then that is accuracy. If, however, you fire bullets or arrows or whatever at the target, and they all perhaps don't hit the center, but they all hit the same place, let's say 10 o'clock, and you do it the same time after time after time after time, you've achieved great precision. If you can achieve precision and accuracy, then you're absolutely off to the races. But there is a difference. And the crucial, sort of to take this a little way forward, aspect of doing the same thing time after time after time is the making of pieces of whatever, whether it's a carburetor or a piece for a refrigerator or a television or an iPhone, that are exactly the same, are crucially, and the word is interchangeable, the making of interchangeable parts, such that if a part fails, you just get another one out of the box and it fits perfectly. So those things, tolerance, interchangeable parts, accuracy and precision, lie at the center of this book. The book is about a great deal more than that, but those four concepts are important to know about.
Is it fair to say, the way I think about it also is that in order to achieve precision, you need to have, it's very much something where you've got tools that allow you to be precise. The accuracy is more a human methodological approach. It's about, first of all, you could have very precise tools but be highly inaccurate because you don't have the right theory and how to approach, let's say.
Well, a good example is, maybe this will be later on in the discussion, but the making of the Hubble telescope.
Right, exactly.
And that was the mirror, when it was ground very precisely. But it was inaccurate because it was 1/50th of the thickness of a human hair, flatter than it should have been. In other words, your intention was to make it a certain dimension, and what actually came out was incredibly precise, but it was wrong. So it was precisely inaccurate.
What was it, the Mars rover in 98? What year was it, or 2001? There was a piece of equipment in outer space that was sent by NASA that cost hundreds of millions of dollars or billions of dollars, and they got one digit off. And they rounded in the wrong air, and I think it was because they were translating from the metric system to...
Well, the classic example of that, on Earth, is the Air Canada flight that filled up with kerosene flying from, I think actually it was an American, rather Canadian plane, flying from, let us say, Chicago to Winnipeg. And it loaded the fuel in gallons, whereas what was required was
liters.
Liters,
and they
exactly.
They overfilled the plane.
Well, the other way around. They put in liters. I think he was therefore flying from Canada to the United States. He said, I want 10,000 gallons. And they put in 10,000 liters, and he ran out of fuel.
I ran out of fuel.
Yeah. And he had to make an emergency landing somewhere in South Dakota or somewhere you don't want to be.
That's wild. I have one more question for you before we proceed along with the substance of the book, and that has to do with how you write something like this. At first, when I began to read the book, I didn't understand why you put the precision numbers there. I sort of understood it as I started reading along. The structure of the book came together for me as I started to read it. You created this structure within which that was relevant to the material. I wonder, do you do that with your other books, and how did you have that thought?
Well, I think the three components to write a successful non-fiction book. First of all, you've got to have a good idea. So there's no point in writing about, your grandmother who collects moths or something. Was no one's going to be
How do you judge a good idea?
Well, I suppose that comes to
that's the talent.
That's something. Yeah, that's the mystery. And you might think that the second component is good writing. I mean, good writing is important, but I think it's not the second most important thing. First important thing is the structure of the book. You can write lyrically about an incredible idea, but if you get the structure wrong or inappropriate or clumsy, you'll lose the reader. And that's what you don't want to do. You want a sort of on. The reader is compelled to say, what next? Mm-hmm. And you, I think, maybe I'm flattering myself, but because you know that the next chapter is going to be about things even more accurate than the one you've just read, you think, well, I better, before I go to sleep tonight, I better look at chapter 5. So with, for instance, a book like, I did books on the Atlantic and the Pacific. And in the Atlantic, gigantic subject, well, how do you corral all this information into one coherent structure? And what I decided to do was to do it sort of chronologically, but base it on the 7 Ages of Man from Shakespeare, from As You Like It. And if you remember from school, it was the infant and then the schoolboy and then the soldier and then the lover and then the judge and the old man and the return to childhood. And it seemed to me that you could look at the ocean from its origins, its childhood. The school child is us getting to know about the ocean, in other words, educating ourselves about the ocean. The soldier would be about all the wars fought across the ocean, everything from Trafalgar to the Vikings to modern warfare. And so it would go on. And similarly with the men who united the states, I decided, and it obviously has to be in a discussion with your editor, I decided I'd do America, looking at it as it were, not necessarily through foreign eyes, although I'm English, so they're sort of foreign, although I'm an American now, but through the structure given to me by the Chinese philosophical elements of earth, air, water, fire, and metal. And it worked out very neatly because you could begin by looking at America in the context of earth, geology, mountains, plains, all the rest of it. And then ending up in metal, which would be things like telegraph wires and the computer age and that sort of thing. And so getting the structure...
So the book was about all the people who, over the centuries, brought the country closer together?
Yes. It was
fascinating.
The physical uniting of the states.
This is what I mean. Like, your books are what a creative idea. What a creative way to think about things. Not many people do that. And that's a common theme throughout all your books, huh?
I try to make it that. I mean, it's obviously not quite when I wrote a book about the Yangtze River. And that's simple travelogue, except that the structure there was that I realized, because I used to live in China, that going upstream from Shanghai towards Tibet, where it rises 4,000 miles away, you're actually going back in Chinese time, because Shanghai is an ultra-modern city. You get to Nanjing, that's famous or infamous in the 30s and 40s. Wuhan, that's famous in 1911, the time of the Chinese Revolution. And then you go up into Western China, it becomes really old-fashioned, full of old temples, and there's a lot of Buddhism there, a lot of Taoism. And so the structure of the book is not simply a travelogue, but it's looking at the river as a vehicle for exploring Chinese history.
That's interesting. You say as you go up, you go back.
Exactly.
There's something similar that I experienced while reading your book, which is that as I went into further detail, as the chapters moved from more and more precise towards more and more precise, I found that I was moving further and further away, and it felt like there was some level of conscious influence on your part as well, moving further away from what made sense. In a sense, the book is both a story about precision, but it's also an homage to imprecision.
I'm so glad you got that. What I did not want the book to be was a sort of a paean to precision, saying precision is good in all of its manifestations. I wanted to say, particularly, and you spotted it so well, thank you, that as you get more and more precise, you want to say, wait a minute, is this good for us? And aren't we forgetting things that we were once very good at, like craftsmanship and working with wood and working with our hands and doing things which are imprecise and which nonetheless remind us of our soul, because, I mean, we're imprecisely made, and yet we're beautiful. I'm not, but some people are very beautiful. And, there's no straight lines in landscape, and yet landscape's very beautiful. Whereas precision is all based with, perfect spheres, perfect straight lines, perfect flatness, perfect fit. is perfection in the end a bit tedious and robbing us of our humanity? So I didn't want to make that. I didn't want this book to be a scold. I didn't want this to be shrill. But I wanted, particularly in the later stages, when you're looking at really, really precise devices, I wanted to say, is this what we really want?
You know what came to me now? Your wife is Japanese, correct?
Yes.
What came to me now when you were speaking, have you seen the Man in the High Tower?
Yes, I have seen The Man in the High Tower.
So I'm sort of reminded when you're speaking that the world of sort of maximum precision is the
Western side.
The Nazi, this future fictitious Nazi regime, and that the imprecise is the Japanese.
It's the Japanese one. And you would, in a funny sort of way, you would think it might be the reverse. But no, the Japanese revere, and I try and make this point in the later chapters of the book, to this day, although they're known for Nikon and Canon and all these highly precise manufacturing companies, the government awards the title of living national treasure to usually rather elderly people who have spent their lives devoted to craftsmanship, making things of woodwork and lacquerware and flower arranging, and things which are elementally human and have nothing to do with engineering. And I think that's wonderful. It's
also wonderful that, and I do remember that from the book, and I think one of the things that we lack in society is a place for the wise, the older people that have come before who have something to share. And in many cases, especially in these busy cities, they become a burden as opposed to anything else. And that's the case in Japan as well. The old have become a burden on the society.
It's so interesting you'd say that. I've often thought, but I don't think I'm clever enough to do it, that I should do a book wandering around the world interviewing elders in societies that have and revere elders. And a woman I met in Hawaii, who is very much inclined to talk to Hawaiian elders, said that if she ever did such a book, or if I ever do such a book, the title is obvious. It would be called The Original Instructions, because these people sort of have the wisdom to know that what the world really should be all about. I think it would be too difficult a book to do, and you might find you were going back to what we said earlier about you can sort of fudge things. I think you might end up being tempted to almost put words in people's mouths, because you would be talking to a lot of shamans in Indonesia and elderly people in the Andaman Islands and things. And you wouldn't quite understand it, you wouldn't quite get it, and there would be a temptation to say, make him say something that makes my point.
That's so interesting that you make that point. Yes, that's a good point. Something else that came to me while you were talking, and it goes back to this distinction between precision and accuracy. In some sense, it could be that as our lives become more precise, they become less accurate, that they are less aligned with our intentions, with the type of life that we want to live, that we may... we
have forgotten and overlooked. And dismissed. We don't perhaps know how we want to live anymore.
Yes.
We're too sort of subsumed in the world of buying new iPhones and televisions and things.
There's less intention.
There's less intention. There's a sort of Socratic argument to be made about... there's an argument to be made of letting life take you along a certain path, rather than necessarily demanding of it things that you think you ought to want, but perhaps deep down you don't.
That was something else that I thought about when I was reading your book, which was, and I wrote it down somewhere here, I had a few things, precision, efficiency, optimization, and order, this need to order. And I think that the common thread for me was the human's mind desire to bend the world to its will. And I think that's sort of, we've become so expert at that. And living, as you say, in a world where there's a certain level of flow, we surrender to life, in a sense, is difficult. And I think it's more difficult than it used to be because we've gotten so good at putting order around the world, the way we want things to be.
Well, I think that's why I live, or try to live the way I do. I mean, I'm far from living a blameless life, but I live a deliberately rural life that I've got a small apartment here in New York, so I can come down and do things like talk to you. But I live on a very remote farm in a very remote village in western Massachusetts, totally non-fashionable. And I have chickens and bees and all that sort of thing. And I love old-fashioned things like stamp collecting. And I'm a real nerd, I'm afraid.
Good, then you're
And I think I mentioned in the book my Sunday morning ritual. And this is being recorded on a Thursday, I think, isn't it?
Yes.
So Sunday, I have 8 clocks in my house, and I've got a barograph that I've been religiously keeping clockwork record of the rises and falls of atmospheric pressure in the village since 2001, I think. And I wind them all up on Sunday morning and set them correctly. So I love the ritual. It takes about an hour, and the clocks are different designs. And some of them chime and some of them don't. But by 8 o'clock, by breakfast time on Sunday morning, all of them are, as they say, in rate. And they're still in rate on Monday, but by Tuesday they're starting to fall out of rate. And by Wednesday and Thursday it's a complete shambles. And then Sunday I have to move the hands forward or backwards. But it reminded me of a lovely line, which I quote, I think, 2 or 3 times in the book, in a novel which I've always liked, a detective story by a woman called Dorothy L. Sayers. It's called Gaudy Night, and it's set in Oxford. And she talks about walking through Oxford late on a summer's night and listening to the college clocks chiming midnight, as she put it, chiming midnight in friendly disagreement. And I love that.
That's a beautiful quote. I remember that from your book. There's also another great quote of yours in the book, which I want to say to our audience because it sort of puts a bow, in a sense, on what we were just discussing, where it speaks to what we were just discussing. Is such a wish for perfection truly essential to modern health and happiness, a necessary component of our very being? I thought that was a great quote. I
think it's a question which increasingly we need to ask, philosophical reasons, for sort of spiritual reasons, if it doesn't sound too pretentious to say so, but also because it seems that we're demanding maybe too much of our devices, both our mechanical devices and our electronic devices, that we're pushing our abilities to machine things to the edge, and dangerously so. And I give an example of a jet engine, a Trent 900 Rolls Royce Trent. There were 4 of them powering a Qantas A380, a big double-decker, fully laden jet going from Singapore to Sydney in 2010. And they were at 7,000 feet, and the engines were spooled up to full power, heading obviously for 35,000 feet cruising altitude, when suddenly the number 2 engine, the one closest to the fuselage on the port side, left-hand side of the aircraft, exploded. Well, it ended happily, mercifully, except the ruined engine, $50 million worth. But when they investigated, they found that the culprit was a tiny titanium pipe about the size of a drinking straw, which had been mismachined by a fellow in Hucknall in northern England and passed by the inspectors. And the wall of the tube was a fraction of a millimetre too thin. And it ruptured and spewed hot oil onto the titanium. Rotor caught fire, all sorts of mayhem resulted. And one wonders whether our ability to machine things down to that level of precision is taxing our mechanical abilities, and whether we've reached, we should say, okay, our jet engines are powerful enough, they're fast enough, let's just, until we never find new materials or something like that, let's just not push things. And oddly enough, since the book was written, I guess I finished it last December, this problem has really gathered momentum. And at the moment, as we speak, there are something like 110 jet aircraft waiting for engines in Toulouse, in France, in Boeing factories in Washington State and down in South Carolina, because no engines can be made that are good enough and free of these kind of mechanical faults, because the technology of building these engines is becoming so difficult. So in a funny sort of world, the way the physical world is telling us, maybe you've gone far enough. Let's pause for a moment.
Interesting. And that actually, if I remember correctly, that's the middle of the book, that chapter, right? It's approximately the middle. And then
yes,
that's where you sort of, as a reader, you say, wow, I've never put that much thought into what goes into these engines on which I rely to fly from here to there. And then we get to the satellite and we get to the microprocessor and the transistors. What was that research like for you? I mean, the last chapter is, I can't even remember the number off the top of my head. It was, I couldn't even say it out, the tolerance level. I have it here for the microprocessor. But what did you learn about, I guess what I'm thinking is, we've experienced this exponential rate of change in society, and we attribute it to Moore's Law and to the microprocessor. But what the book also does is it shows that this is a trend that started before that, really, right? Because there is an exponential trend that occurs in terms of our level of precise engineering.
There certainly is, both mechanical and electronic, but it is now getting, as I've sort of tried to explain in the mechanical world, starting to get out of hand. And in the electronic world, it's becoming near absurd, the levels we're talking about. I mean, Moore's Law, yes, the doubling every couple of years. It seems to be going on, and within the microprocessor community, they insist that it'll continue going on. But the reality is that there are, my iPhone 8 here has a chip in it, the A11 chip, which is an Apple proprietary chip made in Taiwan, has 4.3 billion transistors in it, in something about as big as the nail on my pinky finger. I think the most remarkable statistic that I learned, and Intel confirm it, that there are now more transistors in the world. And bearing in mind the transistor was only invented in 1948, and the first transistor was about the size of my fist. They're now so small that there are more transistors operating in the world today than there are leaves on all the trees in all the world. Now, to get here to the studio today, I was driving down the Massachusetts Turnpike, and it's just wall-to-wall trees on either side of you. And you think, there must be unimaginable numbers of leaves, so that statistic must be wrong. But it is right. They're making 13 trillion transistors a day. And the numbers are such that, if you know your Heisenberg, and you probably know it far better than I do, but you're operating now down at levels which are subatomic. Right. And so things start behaving peculiarly. I mean, it's all quantum, is it? Well, it's quantum mechanics, basically, right, which, as Richard Feynman famously said, no one really understands. And how do materials, how does electric current, how does it all behave at that level? Are we possibly reaching a limit in the world of electronic precision? The engineers say, no. Within this quantum computing, there's optical computing. We can get faster, we can get cleverer. One wonders. And of course, then that leads on to in my view, it's out of the realm of this book, and I didn't write about it at all, but artificial intelligence and robotics. And then combining those two things with ever-increasing levels of precision and ever finer tolerances, and the world starts to descend not necessarily into nightmare, but into a world which seems potentially dystopian.
Was that near your mind while you were writing this book?
It wasn't at all, but I do have this very clever Japanese wife who kept saying to me, reminding me that the Japanese have it in perspective. In other words, as I mentioned earlier, have a love for the imprecise. They worship bamboo in just the same way that they worship titanium. Both are to be revered. But she would say to me increasingly, as I would come back from my study and say, I've made this extraordinary discovery about GPS or about optical glassware or the LIGO observatories, she would say, well, yes, just hold on a minute. I mean, are there limits? Are we going too far? Are we crazily worshipping precision? Are we fetishizing precision? So she's kept me on the straight and narrow and saying, to write this book properly, you need to consider and remind people of the joys of the imprecise as well.
And one of those is the Rolls Royce.
Yeah.
And that's what's so interesting. Another point, I wouldn't have thought it. If you had asked me, I would have said this is a very precise machine. But in fact, the sort of in the contemporary analog would have been Henry Ford and the Ford Motor Company. And you draw that parallel. Can you tell us a little bit about what you write in the book with respect to the Rolls Royce, the process that went into and up, I guess no longer does. I assume they no longer make them by hand.
No,
or do
they don't. And what I do quite deliberately is to compare two iconic motor cars which were built almost exactly the same period of time, from 1908 to 1927. And that, on the one hand, is the Rolls Royce Silver Ghost, which is reckoned to be the sort of...
What a beautiful car.
Stunning.
I had no idea what that car was until I read your book.
They were just wonderful machines.
It's so beautiful.
And nearly all of them that were made, 8,000 were made, nearly all still exist and are running today, which is extraordinary, 120 years later, 115 years later. So you look at that, which was a machine made by hand, lovingly made by old
lovingly made.
Literally lovingly. I remember the first time I have a sort of professional relationship with Rolls-Royce, which came about.
You have to get into this too. This is great. I would love for you to tell our audience whether now or later your history as a writer in L.A. with the L.A. gangs and your use of the Rolls-Royce.
Well, it was probably best to dispose of that now. I mean, basically what happened, I was a reporter for the London Sunday Times, and back in the mid-'80s when commissioning editors spent money like drunken sailors, they came to me one day and said, Winchester, we'd like you to write a series of articles about Europe, because the English don't like Europe and don't know anything about it and want to know even less. But we think we have a responsibility to tell the English what Europe's all about. So will you please get a photographer and go on 6 journeys around Europe, anywhere you like, and by any form of transportation, make each one different, and write a 5,000-word essay on each of these journeys. And the first thing I did, I got hold of a yacht and sailed from Stockholm to Helsinki. Then I got 2, for the photographer, my BMW motorbikes in Munich and rode them to Turin.
That must have been a lot of fun.
It was tremendous fun. Patrick he's now 80.
Did you have the goggles?
I had a full face helmet. I didn't. No goggles, no, with my lips going crazy. No. And then I got 2 horses and we rode them through the Black Forest of southwest Germany.
Wow.
Then we walked, or at least I walked. Patrick took the car. I walked from Cadiz to Gibraltar, round the southwestern rim of Spain. Then I rode on the train from Victoria Station in London to the Victoria Hotel in Brieg in Switzerland on the Italian border. And then we went to a club I belonged to in London to sort of see what we had got in the bag, as it were, and then to discuss the journey that was going to be the lead story, which was a motorcar journey from the westernmost point of Europe, which we defined as the cliffs at the edge of Finistère in western France. Because this was the Soviet Union time, the easternmost point in Europe would be the city of Astrakhan, which is where the Volga meets the Caspian Sea. So we had lunch, and we obviously dined rather well, because at the end, Patrick said, "Do we have to take your rotten old Volvo?" And I said, "No, I tell you what, why don't we see if we can get hold of a Rolls Royce?"
I can't believe you get paid to do this. This is
well,
remarkable.
It was really, I mean, you wouldn't
What a
get
life.
that kind of an assignment today. So I rang up Rolls Royce PR people, and they said, "Call you back in half an hour." And half an hour later they did, true to their word, and said, "We have a Silver Spirit in ocean blue, and it's coming off the production line tomorrow. It's a cancelled order, and if you'd like to come up to Crewe, we'll show you around the factory, and you can take the car for 3 months." So I went up to the factory, and talking about the loving assembly of these cars, there was a man there that showed me a crankshaft, beautifully forged piece of steel, perfectly well polished by hand with chamois leathers, and he had made it such that no one side of it was even a fraction of a gram heavier than any other. So if you put it between 2 bearings and started it spinning, it theoretically would never stop. Well, obviously friction would do for it in the end, but no one side was heavier than another, so it wouldn't have a tendency to slow down. So I've always remembered that. And anyway, I picked up the Rolls Royce, and the only embarrassing thing was the registration number, which was RRM1 for Rolls Royce Motors 1. But the parking meter people outside the Sunday Times office thought it was Rupert Murdoch's car, so never gave it a ticket. And I lived in a little village in Oxfordshire, and whenever I drove it home, all the villagers would gather outside the gates because they thought that Roger Moore had come to stay.
Well, this was what year again?
84.
And they were beautiful cars then. I don't like them now.
No, I don't like them at all. They're nothing to do with whether or not.
But those were beautiful.
They were
those
stunning.
were still
the
beautiful.
Silver Spirit was a lovely car. But the Silver Ghost, I mean, the upshot of that story was they were so pleased with the publicity. They kept giving me Rolls Royces, or lending, obviously. Took them back in the end. But so what I decided to do in this chapter was to compare these 2 cars, which sort of represented the way in which the use of precision in the automobile industry had diverged, because the Rolls-Royce, the Silver Ghost, 1908 to 1927, was all made by hand. And so if a piece didn't fit, the man who was making it by hand would simply file it down until it did fit. Whereas Henry Ford, the car that I chose that was made from 1908 to 1927, was, of course, the Model T. And instead of there being 8,000, that was the number of Rolls-Royces, 16 million Model Ts were made on assembly lines. And if the pieces which were meant to be, and this harks back to the very beginning of our conversation, were meant to be interchangeable, all exactly the same, time after time after time after time, if one piece wasn't, then it wouldn't fit in whatever, the carburetor or the brake lining or the transmission or steering gear. And the production line would stop, and investigators would fan out trying to find what was the offending part, replace it. All the workers would stand around smoking and being bored. It would cost a lot of money. And so precision turns out to have been much more important for the production, the mass production of inexpensive, popular motor cars than for the hand making of ultra-luxurious cars like Rolls-Royces. And the interesting thing is that during those years, from '08 to 27, the price of a Rolls Royce went up dramatically. But during those same years, the price of a Model T went down from $809 in 1908 to $217 in 1927. So everything that Ford wanted, when Ford first came up with the idea of, I want to make motor cars, his whole ethos, unlike Henry Royce, who said, I want to make the best car in the world, Henry Ford said, we live in a beautiful country. I want every American to be able to get on the road and see it. This is a car for the common person. Well, the common people required more precision than did the aristocracy and the rich.
What was the name of the Frenchman who did the same thing for muskets?
Yes, he was called Henri Blanc, and it's an interesting story, really. I mean, this is in the years immediately after John Wilkinson had made his cylinders, and after a man called Joseph Bramah had made locks, and after a man called Henry Maudsley had been making what were called pulley blocks for the Royal Navy, which were the first attempts to mass produce very precise things. Over in Paris, this man, Honoré Blanc, said, well, a piece of very well used, critically important engineering does not take advantage of these methods which Wilkinson and Maudsley and Bramah had pioneered, and that is in the making of muskets, of guns, specifically flintlocks. And a flintlock has 10 parts, beginning with the trigger, and then the thing that actually strikes the spark on the flint, and there's a spring, and there's something called a frizzen pan. And if you were fighting in the heat of battle, let's say, in 1814, let's say 1800, and your trigger broke, then your rifle, your gun was as good as useless, because you'd have to take it back to the armourer and have a completely new gun made. But Honoré Blanc said, well, why don't we make all the parts of the flintlock mechanism identical, so that if you break your trigger, you simply go to a box of triggers and get another trigger and slip it in its place. And so he did this, using jigs and things, made sure that every part was exactly the same time after time after time. And I mean, I know I'm sounding rather boring saying this, but this is crucial. And he laid on a demonstration in a basement of a castle, which still exists in Paris. And he invited all the great and the good to come and see how you could have a box with 50 triggers and 50 springs and 50 frizens and 50 all the various bits. And you could take any pieces and assemble them together, and lo and behold, you've got the makings of a gun. And one of the people who this was demonstrated to was the American minister to France, and that was Thomas Jefferson. And Jefferson, and I've always, hugely admired Jefferson anyway, but this was an indication of his prescience and his intelligence. He realized this was something that should be told to the gun makers of America. And so he wrote a letter by hand, obviously, and had it transported across the Atlantic to the Secretary of War in Washington, saying, we have 2 armories in America, one in Springfield in Massachusetts and one in Harper's Ferry in Virginia. Tell them that they must start making these components for our guns interchangeably. And so the War Department, it took a long time because of bureaucracy, but they got the message and they held a competition. And they said, who wants to give us a demonstration of the making of flintlock muskets, interchangeable parts? And a man stuck up his hand, and that was Eli Whitney. And Eli Whitney was famous because he invented the cotton gin, but had never patented it, and so was relatively poor. He needed the money, and so he knew if he successfully engineered this demonstration, he would get the contract to make 8,000 guns for the US Army. But he cheated. So he laid on a demonstration. It would be too boring to give you the details of what he did. But he essentially hoodwinked all the people that came to his demonstration.
By the way, having read that, he sounds like a modern-day Silicon Valley entrepreneur, sort of pitching investors.
Well, he's
Fake
the
it till you
equivalent
make
of
it.
Elizabeth Holmes at Theranos.
Exactly. Yeah, no, exactly. That's a great point.
And he hoodwinked them, and they didn't know what they were seeing, much as the people who, except for the nice Wall Street Journal reporter who wrote the book, they said, okay, Mr. Whitney, you've made a demonstration which certainly has convinced all of us. So here's your contract for 8,000 guns. And he made them, and they were 5 years late. None of them worked properly. And so to the engineering community, and this was news to me, because I thought, in common with nearly all American schoolchildren, that Eli Whitney was a great hero. He's not. He is a charlatan, he's a villain, and he belongs in the same hall of anti-heroes that Elizabeth Holmes belongs in now.
I listened to another interview of yours, and I learned that you studied geology in school, correct? And you had gone to Africa originally to practice as a geologist, or is that you were doing your PhD there?
No, I wasn't clever enough to do a PhD. I got a degree that in England is called a Desmond, because it's a play on words of Desmond Tutu. It was a 2-2, meaning second-class degree in a second tier of that class. And armed with a Desmond, you could certainly never go off and do a PhD. So I went off to be a geologist in Africa, in Uganda. And, an extraordinary story, far too long to tell here, but I was not very good at my job. I mean, I was supposed to be looking for copper in the foothills of the Ruwenzori Mountains, which are beautiful on the Congo-Uganda border. And I didn't find any copper, and I was there living in a tent in a little village called Kayanjojo. And I was obsessed with mountaineering. And I would go every 2 or 3 weeks to a British Council library in a place called Fort Portal, about 30 miles away, and get any books I could about climbing. And one day I got a book called Coronation Everest by a man called James Morris. And I read it in one go by the campfire, late that night and early into the morning. James Morris had been the London Times correspondent on the expedition to Mount Everest that got to the summit in 1953, 31st of May 1953. And he had never climbed before in his life, but he got up to 26,000 feet. And using an elaborate system of codes, he got the news of the success of the expedition back to London to be published in his newspaper, the London Times, on the morning of the Queen's coronation. I mean, I remember that as a little boy. The Queen was still on the throne today. This was her big day. And to have as an additional piece of news the fact that a British expedition had got to the summit of the world's highest mountain just sort of added cream and jam to the wonderful cake the coronation was going to be. So I thought, my God, this is an amazing story of James's. I wasn't any good at travelling around the world with a hammer and bottle of sulfuric acid and a magnifying glass, but maybe all I had to do was to travel around the world with a pencil and a notebook. And that would be an agreeable way to spend a life. So I wrote to James Morris, who I'd never heard of, and I said, "Dear Mr. Morris, I've just read your book. I'm a 21-year-old geologist living in East Africa, and my basic question is, can I be you?" And he wrote back very kindly, and he said, "If you're serious, then quite honestly, being a writer, you'll never get very rich, but you'll have an extraordinarily valuable, worthwhile and amusing and fun life. So my advice to you is, on the day you receive this letter, not next week, not next month, but the day you receive it, give up your job in Africa, come back to England, get a job on a small local newspaper, and write to me again." Well, to cut a very long story short, I did indeed leave Africa, got a job in the far north of England as a reporter on a daily newspaper. And he was amazed and said things like, "Never lose your sense of wonder, never bother to learn shorthand."
He was amazed that you
I'd
had
actually
done it.
Taken his advice. You've done that? My God, I feel sort of in loco parentis now. So never lose your sense of wonder. Don't become cynical and jaded. Don't bother to learn shorthand. Everyone will tell you you must, but it's a waste of time. And then this was the kicker, really. Every month or so, send me the clippings of the stories you've written for your paper. And down to me, and he lived in a village in North Wales. And I will annotate them and send them back to you, and with any luck, turn you into a halfway decent writer.
And he did that?
He did, for starting in 1967, and we wrote to each other once a month until 1974.
Wow.
When we met for the first time. And Watergate was finished. I had reported on Nixon leaving the White House, and I hadn't reported on Ford pardoning him, because on that particular day, the 8th of September 1974, I was covering Evel Knievel attempting to jump over the Snake River Canyon in Idaho. Big mistake. But anyway, then Washington went quiet, so I decided to take a holiday, and I was still a climber. So I went to North Wales with an Australian, or rather South African girlfriend of mine. And on the way up to North Wales, she said, "Doesn't your friend James Morris live here?" Because everyone knew that James had created the monster that I'd turned into. And I said, "Yes." And she said, "Are you going to see him?" And I said, "I've never spoken to him. The relationship has entirely been by letter." She said, "This is ridiculous."
Were you nervous to meet him?
I was terrified. And Jackie, her name was Jackie Leishman, picked up that when we got to the little hotel we were staying in, picked up the phone and found his number and dialed his number and put the receiver to my ear. And he said, hello. And I said, oh, hello, this is Simon Winchester. And this person said, well, this is James. My God, I mean, I read you every morning from Washington. I created you. You're my protege. Are you calling from America? And I said, no, I'm calling from the Penny Gurut Hotel down the road. And anyway, a long conversation. He said, you must come for tea tomorrow. So Jackie and I, the next morning, we went climbing and came down from the hills at about 3 and motored to this little village called Llanystumdwy, found this beautiful house, parked the car, walked across the gravel to the front door, and you could see the sort of the parquet flooring and the carpets and so forth in the living room, and we were filthy dirty. So I suggested we take our climbing boots off, and I pressed the doorbell, and we were kneeling down on the front doorstep, and the door opened and a woman appeared, and I said, oh, hello, I'm Simon Winchester, and this is Jackie Leishman. You must be Mrs. Morris. And this person said, no, I'm James, actually. And there was this brief moment of disbelief. But then we stood up, and this person said, I'll get my wife. And I thought, now this is spiraling out of control. Because James, had climbed to 26,000 feet on Mount Everest, had been a captain in the British Army and the Brigade of Guards, had fathered 4 children, had walked alone across the Hadramaut in the southern part of Arabia. So whoever was going to come down the stairs would, I assume, be a bearded person with a Yukon Jack shirt. Not at all. Down the stairs comes a middle-aged lady with a little girl in tow, and we all troop off into the drawing room to have tea, with me, fairly obviously a man, and Jackie, fairly obviously a young woman, and Elizabeth Morris, a middle-aged lady, and Suki, a little 9-year-old girl, and my hero, my mentor, twin set and pearls, little hanky tucked up her sleeve, a tweed skirt, legs decorously crossed, little court shoes, and all the chesty accoutrements of, rather substantial accoutrements, I might say, of womanhood. But, being Britain, of course, nothing was said about this. We just drank our tea and talked about other things. And then we left at about 6, and Jackie said to me as we passed through the gates, what the was all that about? I said, I have not the foggiest idea. And the next morning, a note was pushed under my door in the hotel. Dear Simon, I'm sorry to have put you and your friend through a somewhat awkward social situation, but the fact of the matter is that I've decided to change sex, and I'm going to Casablanca, which back in the 70s, that's when it was all done, the chop and change surgery. And if everything's successful, I'm going to return to Britain with the name Jan Morris, and I hope you and I can be friends. Well, Jan and I, she's now 91. We've written a book together on British architecture in India. And I suppose it would be idle to say that we're bosom friends, but we're good friends. And she now lives with Elizabeth, as they used to be sisters-in-law, but they were now allowed to remarry about 10 years ago. And for years afterwards, The Guardian, if it ever got an application from someone to be a reporter, they said it's very easy to become a reporter on The Guardian. All you need to do is to go to Oxford and get a bad geology degree, and then make friends with a transsexual.
That's so funny. That's remarkable, and that must have been quite a shock. I mean, that it was sure it was the 70s. It was on the heels or on the tail of the counterculture, but still, today I wouldn't say it's common, but we're becoming more educated about this.
It's part of the national conversation.
Yeah.
Jan wrote a wonderful book called Conundrum about it, published in 76, I think, still in print today. And I urge anyone that's curious about this to know, because there's an awful lot of gender reassignment surgery going on these days, and it's become, I wouldn't say tedious, but almost commonplace. Whereas in 74, no one knew about it. And her book is a very tender treatment of the whole thing.
I'm always amazed. Amazed isn't even the right word. I don't know how someone finds the courage to do that.
No, well, I've never had the urge, but I think no. But I mean, Jan talks about sitting under the piano as a 4-year-old, saying, why am I dressed like a boy?
Wow.
I'm a girl. I want to be a girl. And so, although he went through all the accepted rituals of getting married and having children, and he didn't want to do any of those things, and had this incredibly sympathetic wife who...
Remarkable. That's
still
also
the
remarkable
wife
when I hear
day.
about that. That
is the most extraordinary thing. Elizabeth's story is, to me, the more compelling story.
Really?
To me, yes.
Has she considered writing a book about it?
I don't think so. She's a very diffident woman. She's wonderfully capable, clearly very, very tolerant. And I don't know, it's macabre to think who will go first. I mean, they're both in their 90s. Elizabeth is a little bit older, and I think gender reassignment places all sorts of stresses on the body. I imagine it would. So how long the two of them will survive, I don't know. But Jan is still writing. She wrote a book about the battleship Yamato, Japanese super battleship, just last year.
You all have a lot in common.
Well, I think so, except I check myself in the shower each day, and we don't have that much in common.
Well, I have another question for you. When you read James's book, so you are a nonfiction writer. You've never written fiction, correct?
I've written one book
of
fiction, but it was a
it was a mistake.
Well, I was asked to write what was called a future history, about writing it from the perspective of 2020, or what had happened after Hong Kong passed back to China in 1997.
Oh, interesting.
It was sort of quite an interesting thesis. There was a war between China and Japan, which could yet happen. But it's not.
Which book was that?
It was called A Pacific Nightmare, and it was published in, I think, 1993 or thereabouts.
That was the sequel to the Pacific book?
Well, oddly enough, I'd written a book about the Pacific in the early 90s, then Pacific Nightmare, and then the new Pacific. So I'm all Pacific'd out.
Pacific'd out. I'm curious, though. So you read James's book. You read the story of a person who piggybacked off the expedition and wrote about it. What was it about that you said, this is what I want to do?
Well, it was Jan, I suppose. Yes, that's the name I'll give her, because I think most of the advice subsequent to my getting to know her really well came when she was a woman. She said, you've got to write books, because writing for newspapers, yes, it's immediately satisfying, but you have to accept that what you write will be in a newspaper that will, 3 days after you've written it, will be lining the bottom of a parrot's cage or wrapping up fish and chips or something like that. Whereas a book, at least, there's a possibility of some posterity. Books remain. I mean, yes, you see these big sales of books outside libraries, but most of them are fiction, body-stripping fiction, which has a very short lifespan. But non-fiction books can last for many years. I mean, for instance, I wrote a book about the eruption of the volcano Krakatoa, and I think, I don't want to sound conceited about this, but that'll probably be the definitive book about Krakatoa for many, many years.
Which volcano is that? Where is that located?
Krakatoa is a big, huge volcano which erupted between Java and Sumatra in 1883, August the 27th. And it was the first event. It was the beginning of the global village because of an interesting fact that they had just completed the submarine cable. The news of Lincoln's assassination in 1865 took 12 days to reach London. The news of Krakatoa's eruption, an operator working for Reuters sent a message saying Krakatoa erupting, because it was happening as he was on the sender. Many feared dead, and then the line went dead and he was killed. But the message got to Jakarta. Then it went on the cable under the sea to Singapore, from Singapore to Colombo in Ceylon or Sri Lanka, then up to Suez in the Red Sea, then across the Mediterranean to Gibraltar, then through into the Atlantic and up to Biarritz, then up to Cornwall, then up to London. And that message saying Krakatoa erupted, many dead, was on the desk of the London Times 4 minutes later. And that meant that it was published with obviously embellishment once research had been done the next morning in the London Times. And people were sitting in their horse-drawn carriages going to work, reading about places in the world that they'd never heard of, Java, Sumatra, Krakatoa, things that had happened just hours before, with the same easy familiarity that they might have been talking about Bayswater or Mayfair or Liverpool. And so I believe, well, I'm absolutely certain of it, that it was the first major news event in the world that was known about all over the world within minutes of it occurring.
That period in the last quarter of the 1800s of the 19th century and then towards the beginning of the 20th century, there was such a reorganization. I mean, I know it from American history of American life and dealing with the railroads and then the telegraph and the telephone. It was a remarkable time. I mean, that's what you're sort of capturing there.
Oh, and that's sort of what I was saying in The Men Who United
Exactly,
the States.
that's what I was thinking about when you were saying
the way
that.
that the country suddenly developed, quite extraordinary. And of course, this is another period when things are changing, the paradigm is shifting.
I'd read this book by can't remember the name of the author, but I read this book called The Land of Desire. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it's a history. It was written in 1992. It's a history of consumer capitalism from the late 19th century to the early 20th. And I remember this one particular scene when he tied abstract art, the rise of abstract art, to not specifically people riding in rail cars, but the experience of riding in a rail car and seeing the landscape move so quickly by was an abstract experience of the land. And that stuck out to me when you were talking. Mr. Winchester, I really appreciate you coming onto the program.
It's a great pleasure.
Thank you so much.
I've enjoyed it enormously. Thank you
very much.
And that was my episode with Simon Winchester. I want to thank Mr. Winchester for being on my program. For more information about today's episode, or if you want easy access to related programming, visit our website at hiddenforces.io and subscribe to our free email list. If you're a regular listener, take a moment to review us on Apple Podcasts. Each review helps more people find the show and join our amazing community. Today's episode was produced by me and edited by Stylianos Nicolaou. For more episodes, you can check out our website at hiddenforces.io. Join the conversation at Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Hidden Forces Pod, or send me an email at dk@hiddenforces.io. As always, thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.